All right, I'm going to go ahead and kick us off, which is a really exciting thing to be able to do. This is the very first inaugural virtual seminar hosted by the Sustainable Education Research Initiative at Brown, otherwise known as SustainableED. We are going to be hosting a series of 4 free and public virtual seminars given by esteemed researchers and experts in the field across a range of topics at the intersection of education and climate change. For those of you who are not familiar with Sustainable Ed, we are an initiative at Brown University hosted at the Annenberg Institute that is dedicated to advancing research at the intersection of education and climate change and to supporting more resilient and sustainable schools. It is my distinguished pleasure to be able to introduce Jorge Cuartas. Jorge is an assistant professor in the Department of Applied Psychology at NYU Steinhardt and is the director of Catalyzing Action for Resilient Ecologies, or the CARE Lab. He is an expert in child development with research covering a range of both topics and global contexts. His work with the lab explores how climate change impacts child development, experiences, and family dynamics. I know that we here at Sustainable Ed have benefited greatly from his own expertise and work to inform thinking about how um, climate change impacts students' readiness for school, what they show up um, on day one, having experienced even before they're part of a formal education setting, which is so important. We're thrilled to hear more about that. Let me turn it over to you, Jorge.
Thank you very much, Matt, for this wonderful invitation. And first of all, a huge congratulations to you and to SustainableED for launching this very important initiative, which is very much needed in research, but also to inform practice and policy in relation to education and climate change. So it is a huge honor to be the first one presenting in this seminar. And it's great also to see so many people joining us today. Thank you very much for joining us. So as Matt mentioned, I'll be talking about climate change and early childhood development in particular. And as he mentioned, an assistant professor at New York University and also a researcher at Universidad de los Andes in Colombia. And to get us started, I wanted to talk a little bit about why is it that I'm so interested in early childhood development, and why is it that early childhood development is so important for education across the life course. According to evidence from neuroscience, economics, psychology, sociology, public health, and a lot of other disciplines, early childhood is a sensitive period of development, and it is considered a sensitive period because we have a heightened neuroplasticity, meaning that the experiences that we live, the contexts where we develop, are highly influential on our brain development, our biological development, and in the development of pre-academic skills, cognitive, social, emotional, and executive function skills that are relevant for the life course and learning across life. We know from the science that what happens early in life is consequential not only for cognitive development or only for the brain, but we also know that all biological systems are deeply interconnected. And this implies that all of these experiences are going to be consequential not only for our learning and cognitive development, but also for our physical health, our mental health, and all of these other inputs, which we know are critical for children and adolescents to learn and to thrive in educational settings and in society more broadly. And a final principle that I think it's important to keep in mind when talking about early childhood is the idea that skills produce more skills. This is something that economics and psychology and education science has shown quite a lot, and is the basic idea that if children develop early cognitive, socioemotional, and executive function skills, this will facilitate the further acquisition of skills later in life. So I think that all of this shows that the things that happen during early childhood are highly consequential for our learning across the life course. And we actually showed in a recent study published in The Lancet that not investing in early education and early education with quality can be quite costly for societies. We estimated that failing to invest in high quality early education can amount to 2 to 7% of the gross domestic product of countries, whereas the benefits of doing such investment can be 8 to 19 times higher than the cost of implementing such initiatives. And I think that this is one of the reasons why in the Sustainable Development Goals, in particular in Sustainable Development Goal number 4, which refers to quality education, we have a very specific target 4.2, referring to early childhood development as something that has been recognized not only in research, but also in policy as critical and a foundation for quality education across the lifespan. With this context in mind, we also know from developmental psychology and other sciences that early childhood development happens within ecological contexts. In particular, within something that I'm going to call geobioecological context. And I'm including this geo prefix to the term because geo comes from the Greek earth or the Greek Gaia, referring to the earth. And this is something that I think it's important for us to start doing, even from this starting point, to acknowledge the critical role of natural ecosystems and climate for human development in general. So we know that child development and learning depends on biological and psychological factors. We also know that it depends and is shaped by cultural and social factors, economic policies, the socioeconomic conditions of families. But we also have increasing evidence showing that it also depends on these natural ecosystems. We know that climate can influence, for example, learning. We know that it can influence mental health. So I would like to set us as a starting point to think about this geobioecological context as critical for shaping child development and learning. With this basis on early childhood, we know that this geoecological context has been changing a lot and has been receiving quite a lot of pressure from climate change in particular. We know that climate change is leading to profound impacts on the ecology of human development. There's a lot that has been said in the news and in academic research on how it is impacting livelihoods and survival globally. This is something that it's not a future threat, but we know is a present reality that we can see with our own eyes and that the science has documented pretty well. And we know that one of the main symptoms of this issue of climate change is that temperatures are rising globally. Actually, in 2023 and now in 2024, we have been reaching record temperatures, right? We already passed the 1.5 degrees Celsius that was established in the Paris Agreement. So we are not in a great position regarding these policy goals in relation to climate change. But despite all of this, in the literature, we have very few research, and then in policy and practice, we have very few actions and strategies in relation to climate change and early childhood development. And this is exactly a reason why I decided to launch a research agenda working on how climate change affects early childhood development and what can we do as researchers, practitioners, policymakers, educators to support children's development and learning in this new reality that we all are currently facing. Thinking about children in particular, UNICEF estimated that 99% of young children around the world are already exposed to climate hazards, including heat waves, including extreme weather events, and others. And something that is actually quite concerning is that 1 billion children, which is about 50% of the global population of children, are classified as in extremely high risk due to these exposures in combination with lack of access to basic goods and services, such as clean water, such as adequate sanitation, such as healthcare and education services. So this is almost a perfect storm that we need to acknowledge, and we need to conduct more work to understand what to do about it. Given this general context, something that we decided to start doing was thinking how is it that climate change could affect human development, and in particular, how exposure to these climate hazards in early childhood can lead to cascading effects on development and learning across the life course. And what we developed in this conceptual framework that you can find published in Child Development Perspectives is that climate change produces changes and impacts on the physical environment. We already know about temperature rise, about shifts in weather patterns, ecological degradation, sea level rise, and other extreme weather events such as floods, droughts, wildfires, and heat waves. And we know from this geobioecological perspective that I discussed at the beginning of my talk, that these changes in the physical environment are going to lead to changes also in societies, communities, families, and in turn in children's development and learning. For societies, we have plenty of evidence on how climate change can lead to macroeconomic distress, destruction of key infrastructure such as roads, hospitals, schools, also lack of access to clean water, to food, and to shelter. And we also have growing evidence on how climate change and climate hazards can increase the risk for conflict. We have some evidence, in particular for sub-Saharan Africa and also for Syria, on how climatic events played a role in increasing the risk for these conflicts that we all have been seeing also in the news. At the community level, we know that climate change can also lead to displacement of families. We are already seeing that in the US, in my country, Colombia, and around the world. But we also know that it can increase poverty. It can disrupt key services, such as health and education services. A lot of schools may close due to climate hazards. And in general, we also know that it can reduce safety in outdoor environments, in general, reducing learning opportunities for children. And then at the family level, we hypothesized that climate change can also lead to separation of family members, to morbidity and mortality due to its impacts on human health. But in general, it can also lead to traumatic events that we know can increase the stress of caregivers, and in doing so, also affect children indirectly. With this conceptual framework, something that I want to share is that we have very good reasons to think that climate change can affect early childhood development and learning, but also to disclose something that I think is very important, and is the fact that we have very few evidence on these different pathways. So I would like to definitely invite all of you to think about this and to conduct also more work and research on these different areas. So far, building on this framework, we have been conducting multiple literature reviews to understand some of these pathways. For example, we explored in a rapid review of the literature how climate change may affect families and also how may affect young children. And something that we found specifically for early childhood development is that we definitely lack evidence on this regard. In a systematic review, which is under review right now, and we hope will be published in a couple of months, we looked for all the potential studies and evidence linking excessive heat with early childhood development. And we could only find 5 studies doing that, only 5. That's nothing, right? Like that's very, very few number of studies, which definitely shows the need that we have on working and building on this evidence base. Out of these 5 studies, 4 focus mostly on exposure to excessive heat prenatally, and only one study examined exposure during early childhood and developmental outcomes. But in general, what the literature shows is quite consistent and is associations between exposure to excessive heat and climate hazards and negative child outcomes, including pre-academic skills, socioemotional skills, and motor skills. So all the literature that we have so far points to a direction of risks caused by climate change on early childhood development. After conducting these literature reviews, we concluded that there's a lot of evidence for some of the pathways that I presented on the framework. We found quite some evidence on how climate change could affect learning during adolescence. So thinking about learning across the life course, we have evidence on how, for example, heat waves can reduce achievement in standardized assessments. There's also a lot of evidence from around the world on how these hazards can affect physical and mental health. And the finding for mental health I find to be quite concerning, but also quite fascinating from a scientific standpoint, given how much evidence there is on how these different hazards, including excessive heat, can increase the risk for depression, anxiety, and other mental health problems. And finally, there's also quite a lot of evidence on how excessive heat and these climate hazards can increase aggressive behavior. But in contrast, we have way fewer studies and also weaker evidence for links between climate change and child development, and also things that happen in children's microsystems, their proximal context of development. For example, within the family system, we have very few evidence on how climate change may affect parenting or may affect learning opportunities in the family system. So this is something that I was very interested in, and I decided to start focusing my research agenda specifically on those 3 factors. First, excessive heat. Second, the things that may happen in the family system. And finally, how all of this may ultimately impact early childhood development, and in doing so, may affect learning and development across the life course. With this interest, something that I began thinking about and something that I would love to discuss with all of you is why excessive heat, why heat may be so important for early childhood development and for learning. And to begin, let me define excessive heat as temperatures that are significantly higher than normal for a given location and season. So here I am not comparing hot regions with cold regions. I am interested in temperatures that are above what is typical, right? Atypical temperatures that may be caused by climate change. We know that heat and excessive heat as well can be regulated by our body, in particular our temperature control systems, through redistributing blood toward the skin and sweating as well. But we also know that excessive heat in particular can overwhelm these biological temperature control systems and cause something that is known as heat stress. There's a lot of evidence on how heat stress can affect physical health, but not as much for early childhood development as I already mentioned. We also know that this heat stress can affect humans during pregnancy, in early childhood, in adolescence. But again, I want to focus specifically on early childhood. And I want to focus on early childhood for a couple of reasons. The first one is that we know from different sciences that heat can affect young children way more than it does with adults. And this is because young children's small bodies tend to heat up more quickly. Their underdeveloped systems can also find it more difficult to release heat via sweating, so it's way harder for their biological systems to deal with the heat. And finally, because young children depend entirely on adults to seek for water or cooler environments to deal with heat. So there's also a vulnerability caused by this dependency on adults. And then we also have very good reasons to believe that heat can affect young children more than adults for reasons such as the fact that heat undermines sleep quality. And we know that sleep during childhood, and in particular during early childhood, is critical for children's growth, development, and learning. So here we have a potential mechanism explaining those associations. We also know that the brain automatically detects excessive heat as a threat for survival or for safety in general. And that can lead to the release of stress hormones and to stress responses that, if continued or severe, can lead to disruptions in the healthy brain, biological, and skill development during early childhood. In addition to this, we also hypothesize that heat can undermine parenting. First of all, because a lot of evidence from biology shows that excessive heat can disrupt hormones and neurotransmitters that regulate irritability and aggression. And that's the reason why some of the evidence that we have shows that heat can increase aggression and can increase things like civil conflicts, as I already mentioned. So there's a good rationale to believe that excessive heat can also do some effects on parents, increasing aggressive behaviors potentially. In addition to this, excessive heat can also impair cognitive and executive function, which are critical skills that parents require to provide early learning opportunities. So we have yet another mechanism linking excessive heat with parenting. And finally, we also know that excessive heat can make outdoor environments less comfortable and less safe. There's actually some evidence from preschoolers in Texas showing that they engage less in physical activity and more in sedentary behaviors in hotter days relative to colder days. So there's definitely barriers to early learning opportunities when we face excessive heat, including also things like school closures in certain places where there is no infrastructure like air conditioning, for example, to deal with this heat. And in general, all of this is going to cause less learning opportunities and less opportunities to interact with others, which we know are critical ingredients for early childhood development. All of these are hypotheses that we had in our study, but we also wanted to use these hypotheses to start conducting empirical research and showing whether these pathways were making sense or not. So we decided to start conducting studies with data from UNICEF, in particular the Multiple Indicators Cluster Survey. This is a wonderful set of surveys, household surveys, with comparable rich information on early childhood development and also their context of development. We have data for more than 20,000 child-mother diets. So this is data that it's nationally representative also for the countries included in the sample. And something that is quite nice about this service is that we have the precise location of households. So we can link that data with satellite data on temperature to understand children's exposure to different temperatures in different seasons, and in doing that, study how excessive heat may affect their development. This is how our data looks like. Each blue dot is a house or a group of houses. And as you can see, we have the houses, and then we have in the back a layer of temperature. So we have the specific, the longitudinal data for the temperature that each household was exposed in different periods during children's development. And having such data set allowed us to characterize children's exposure to temperature not only in the moment of the survey, but also throughout their life, right? We can understand the typical temperature children are exposed to during their lifetime, and also to understand whether they have been exposed to atypical temperatures recently, in particular weeks or months before the UNICEF survey that we are using. In this survey, in addition, we have data from the Early Childhood Development Index, which is a highly policy relevant indicator. It is included in the Sustainable Development Goals, actually, and it measures child development in four main domains. It measures literacy, numeracy, physical development, social emotional development, and also approaches to learning. So we have a very nice source of information for child development here, as well as data related to parenting, in particular, caregivers' engagement in different stimulating activities, early learning activities, such as playing, singing, reading books, telling stories, and other activities that we know are important for child development, as well as data about how caregivers discipline their children. We have data on nonviolent discipline, such as explaining why certain behaviors are wrong. And we also have data on violent discipline, including physical punishment and psychological aggression. So using this data, we employed quasi-experimental approaches, and I'm not going to waste a lot of time on this, but I'm happy to respond to questions if you have any questions about the approach. But the summary for the approach is that given that we can characterize children's exposure to temperature during their life course, we can understand the typical temperature for the region where they live and the different seasons that they experience. And with that data, we can also identify excessive heat. We can identify atypical temperatures children may have been exposed to. And we leverage that variability to understand how atypical temperatures can affect early childhood development and also the different parenting domains that I just mentioned. With that approach and that data, we found that there's very robust evidence that atypical temperatures, excessive heat, associate with a lower likelihood of young children being developmentally on track, according to the Early Childhood Development Index. In particular, we found that children who were exposed to atypical temperatures above 32 degrees Celsius were between 1.8 and 7.7 percentage points less likely to be developmentally on track. And it was almost a linear relationship, with higher temperatures reducing even more the probability of being developmentally on track. We also found something that I think makes a lot of sense with the conceptual framework that I shared, and also the role that we all know inequities play on how different individuals can react or respond to adversities and threats, because we found that the effects of excessive heat were not equally distributed, but were stronger for certain kids and certain households. Specifically, we found that the negative effects of excessive heat were more severe for poorer households compared to wealthier ones, also in urban areas relative to rural areas, and it makes a lot of sense with the idea of the urban heat island and the idea that in urban areas, temperature tends to concentrate more than in rural areas. And finally, we also found stronger effects for households lacking access to improved water and sanitation services, which also makes a lot of sense because in these households, they may find more challenges to deal with heat, and heat may lead also to worse consequences through contamination of water sources, right? So we have a compounded risk for these specific households. Then, given my interest in not only documenting impacts on early childhood, but also understanding these mechanisms related to parenting, we conducted other studies for stimulation and discipline. And what we found also makes a lot of sense because we found that excessive heat in the month before the survey increase the risk for severe physical punishment and psychological aggression. So this is quite consistent actually with the biomedical literature that I shared at the beginning of my talk on how excessive heat can increase irritability, impulsivity through physiological and biological processes. So to my knowledge, this is the first time that we are showing in the literature that this is true also within the family system, and in doing that increases the risk for violence against children, which we know can be quite harmful and consequential for young children's learning and development. And in addition, we also found that following heat waves and excessive heat, caregivers engage less in these stimulating activities such as reading, playing, telling stories, and all of those activities that are critical for young children's development. So there's an increase in risky parenting behaviors and a decrease in the behaviors that we know are critical to establish a solid early learning environment. So we have produced what I think is novel evidence to show pathways through which climate change can affect young children's development starting very early in life. With this evidence, and to conclude and to launch a discussion and hear your questions and your thoughts, I think that all of us have seen that there is growing evidence in academia, in policy, in practice of promoting preparedness, adaptation, and resilience in the face of climate change. But something that we often miss is this significant group of the population, which are young children. We have been doing some policy work in Latin America and around the world in general. And in the response plans for governments, there's very few mentions of young children. So we definitely need to start paying more attention to young children and to include them in policies and in strategies in relation to climate change and to respond to emergencies caused by climate change. I think that also there's a huge need for educational innovations in order to support children and families, including resilient infrastructure, also including hybrid approaches so that we can offer continued services and education, in particular when we face extreme weather events and disasters. But we also need to think more about the curriculum and how to work with families to raise a generation of children that take climate change way more seriously and produce a transformational change in our society, economy, and climate in general. We also know that early childhood establishes the foundations for learning, health, cognitive, social, emotional, behavioral development. And in doing that, it also establishes the foundations for sustainable development more broadly, right? If we raise a generation of children who are more conscious of climate change, we definitely will have a brighter future when they are the ones in charge of our economy, our political system, our schools, and society in general. So it's definitely a smart investment to invest in young children's development and to include these issues of climate change while doing that work. To conclude, today, I have shown that there is good rational and theoretical work to believe that climate change may affect young children's development, and we have now growing evidence showing that that's indeed the case. We have evidence that climate hazards can affect young children and can affect their proximal learning environments. I think that with this work and this presentation, I'm also hoping to show you that we can leverage multidisciplinary perspectives as well as novel methods to leverage existing data to understand not only impacts of climate change, but also mechanisms through which climate change may affect children, and also moderators or heterogeneity in the effects of climate change. And I think that understanding these mediators, mechanisms, and moderators is critical for us to understand potential factors and variables that we can intervene with strategies, interventions, and policies. And in doing that, to inform action looking forward. And finally, I think that when we talk about climate change, we definitely need to acknowledge that we need a shift in mindset and a shift in policies and economic models to deal and to address climate change. We know that the prevailing economic model is deepening the climate crisis, so we definitely need to work on that. And we can also work as educators and researchers with families and children to promote critical thinking and the skills that we all need as society to join and collectively to catalyze this change in policies and the economic model that the planet and therefore all of us urgently needs. To conclude, I would like to invite all of you to visit my lab website. We have some updates on our work there, and it would be nice also to connect with all of you if you have any questions or ideas for research or for action. And also would like to invite you to the website of Developmental Scientists for Climate Action. It's a group of researchers, including myself, working on how to use developmental, psychological, and educational evidence and science to create all the transformations and the action that is needed for young children, families, and communities as a whole. With that, I will conclude. Thank you very much again for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and to the discussion. Thank you.